I've mentioned scope creep a few times throughout these videos, and this just refers to how projects can get a little bloated over time and change from their original scope and original requirements and original goals. Now, all projects change, and as the project manager, you have to do what you can to control and manage those changes and make sure that they don't affect the scope. To do that, well, there's a lot of ways to do it. Some ways involve keeping the project goals in mind and keeping the business strategy in mind. So at the start of a project, you should know what the end should look like, and you have the requirements that you've already defined and collected. And you have a business strategy. The project somehow has to fit within your business goals. If you keep those in mind, you're going to do a better job of controlling scope creep throughout the project. 3 months, 6 months into the project, as more people come on and more things change with the project, if things start to get added to the project that don't really fit the project goals or the business goals, then you can see that as a project manager and decide that no, we need to trim those off and we can't be adding these new things. You can't prevent change, but you can deal with it. And there's a couple different ways to deal with it. One involves knowing the requirements and having a laser-like focus on the requirements as well as your scope definition. You can't prevent scope creep without a clear definition of scope. It all goes back to the planning stages. If you've done a really good job of planning your scope, of planning your requirements, then as the project progresses, you'll be better suited to meet the challenges that come with changes because you're focused on those end goals. You've clearly defined them from the start. Variance, it simply refers to the difference between the planned performance and the actual performance. And you should allow for some variance. Scope creep it's excessive variance. And variance isn't a bad thing, because you should be flexible in your project as things change, but you don't want to be too flexible that things get so out of control that the project just capsizes. So make sure you know your tolerance for variance and have defined your tolerance for variance. IT projects are especially difficult when controlling scope because technology changes so fast. It's different than constructing a building or a park or something like that. On those, scope is more fixed. On IT projects, the scope can be a lot more flexible, which can be a good and a bad thing. This is the Tulsa Gathering Place. This is an ambitious park project that was planned over several years and developed over several years. And the planners had to set initial requirements for this and define the scope of the project. They had to secure land, they had to hire architects, get input from citizens, look at budgets, break everything down into work packages so individual elements of this Tulsa Gathering Place park could be constructed. And they had to control the scope creep over time so that everything stuck to the initial plan. This is a good example of how scope can be kept under control. And even though things change, with proper project management, you can make sure to not let things get too out of control. Another thing that you need to do, or that would benefit you, especially as an IT project manager, is improve user input. And this involves getting people who are using the project involved with doing some of the planning for the project. If you get enough user input throughout the life of your project, especially if it's an IT project, you're going to have a better sense of how it's going to fit the goals and how your project is going to fit the goals that the users need. It's important to develop a good project selection process and have users on the project team. So if there's a target market that you're seeking, get people from that target market to be involved in the planning stages so that you know that the project is going to meet their needs. It's important to have regular meetings with defined agendas so that users can come in and interact with the developers and the people doing the project. Think if you're developing a mobile app, but you've never asked the users who are going to use this mobile app what they want in this mobile app. You can't do that. There's a company called Affinity, and the company is actually called Serif, and they make a program called Affinity Photo, not Infinity, but Affinity. And it's basically a Photoshop competitor. And if they didn't use users as part of their design and development process, then they wouldn't understand what their software needs so that it can be a viable competitor to Photoshop. If you don't have users involved, you're not going to do as good of a job as you might when it comes to meeting the needs of the users. It's also important to deliver something on a regular basis so that users know what to expect. Under promise and over deliver is one of the best things you can do as a project manager, especially when it comes to getting input from users. You don't want to tell users you're going to do one thing and then you can't meet that. You want to tell them you can do this and then deliver more than what you said to surprise them and make sure that you're actually exceeding their expectations. You can even locate users with developers. And I don't know that I'd recommend that all the time because users don't always know what they want. and they could just be a hassle and a nuisance for the developers. But users can provide valuable input in terms of how the finished product is shaping up to meet their needs. On the next slide, I've got an example of what it means to involve users on sort of a, I don't know, it's kind of fake, but it works. So GM for a while had these commercials. They called them real people, not actors. And I'm pretty sure they were all just actors. But GM basically made commercials where they would bring people into a room and ask them, what do you want in a car? And people would say, oh, I like safety, I like reliability, I like high-tech features and things like that. It was all a gimmick, but the idea was that people would say these things, and then ta-da, underneath these cars, or underneath these blankets was a GM vehicle that met all their requirements, and not a Ford or a Honda or whatever it might show. It might have made for a good commercial, but it wasn't really a great way of getting user input. You should be a little more scientific than that. The point is, when you're working on an IT project, make sure what you're doing matches what people expect. And if users are expecting one thing, but you're developing something and delivering something different, then you're going to have a problem. So it's important to do all these things to manage scope throughout the life of a project. Have users involved, stick to the work breakdown structure, stick to the plan that you've put in place, and learn how to say no when other features tend to creep in that might detract your project or detract you from hitting those initial goals of your project.